The notification from my bank app glowed on my screen at 3:47 a.m., the harsh light cutting through the darkness of Emma's hospital room. Insufficient funds for automatic payment. My hands trembled as I stared at the words. The steady beep of my daughter's foot pumped the only sound in the sterile silence. 7-year-old Emma slept fitlessly in her bed. Her once golden hair now just wisps beneath the pink unicorn beanie I'd bought to keep her head warm. In that moment, watching the numbers that represented our last hope drain away while my child fought for her life, I understood what it meant to be truly alone. I'm Rebecca Thompson, and this is the story of how my family stole from a dying child, and how I found the strength to fight back when I had nothing left to lose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Seattle Children's Medical Center never really turn off. They dim around 8 p.m., but there's always that persistent glow, that constant hum that becomes the soundtrack to your worst nightmares. I'd been living in these hallways for 3 months, ever since the doctor sat us down in that small consultation room and said the word that shatters worlds. Leukemia. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, to be exact. Emma had just turned 7 2 weeks before the diagnosis. We'd thrown her a birthday party at the park, and she'd run around with her friends, her blonde ponytail bouncing in the spring sunshine. In the photos from that day, if you looked closely, you could see the bruises on her legs that we dismissed as normal kid clumsiness. You could see how pale she was, how tired she looked even while smiling. The signs were there, screaming at us, but we were too busy living normal lives to hear them. The treatment protocol was aggressive. Chemotherapy that would span years, not months. Hospital stays that stretched from days into weeks. Michael, my husband, had to keep working. Someone had to maintain the insurance, pay the rent on our small Northgate apartment, keep some semblance of normal life going for when Emma came home. So I became the one who lived at the hospital. I slept in the vinyl chair that converted into something the nurses generously called a bed. I learned the names of every nurse on the pediatric oncology floor. I knew which vending machine had the best coffee, which bathroom had the shower that actually got hot, and exactly how many steps it was from Emma's room to the family waiting area where I would go to cry where she couldn't hear me. My family rallied, or so I thought. My mother Patricia organized a meal train through her church. My father David set up a GoFundMe campaign, his silver hair and sincere eyes perfect for the video he recorded asking for help. My brother Brandon, who worked in real estate and always had money for the newest gadgets and luxury vacations, promised he'd handle coordinating all the financial donations. He said I had enough to worry about. He said family takes care of family. He created a joint account specifically for Emma's medical expenses, something he called the Emma Thompson Medical Fund. He added my name to it along with his own and my parents' names. That way, he explained, anyone in the family could contribute directly, and we could all access it when bills came due. It seemed thoughtful. It seemed like the kind of thing a devoted uncle would do for his niece. The GoFundMe exploded beyond anything we'd imagined. Emma's story, my father's heartfelt video, the photos of her smiling despite the tubes and wires, it touched something in people. Friends from elementary school I hadn't spoken to in years donated. My coworkers from the marketing firm where I'd worked before Emma got sick contributed. Strangers from across the country sent money with messages of hope and prayer. Within 2 weeks, we'd raised $47,000. I remember crying in the hospital bathroom when Brandon called to tell me. Not just crying, sobbing with relief so intense it felt like my chest might crack open. We could do this. We could afford the experimental treatments insurance wouldn't cover. We could pay the specialists. We could give Emma every possible chance. Brandon handled everything. He sent me screenshots of deposits, updates on the account balance. He seemed to be at the bank constantly, managing transfers, organizing receipts. My mother praised him endlessly in the family group chat, the one called Emma's Warriors that included my parents, Brandon, my Aunt Diane, Uncle Frank, and Brandon's son Tyler. "Look at how Brandon is stepping up," she wrote. "This is what family does." The heart emojis flooded in. Everyone agreed. Brandon was the hero of this tragedy, the one keeping everything together while I focused on Emma. Michael and I liquidated everything we could. We cashed out our small retirement accounts, penalties be damned. We sold my car since I was living at the hospital anyway. Michael could manage with his old truck. We put our few valuable possessions on Facebook Marketplace. My engagement ring, the one Michael had saved for months to buy when we were 23 and stupid in love, went to a pawn shop. I didn't cry when I handed it over. It was just metal and stones. Emma was flesh and blood and the only thing that mattered. Every dollar went into that joint account, into the fund that was supposed to save our daughter's life. The hospital social worker, Janet Willis, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and sensible shoes who'd seen every possible variation of family crisis. She pulled me aside one morning after Emma's chemo session, her hand gentle on my arm. She asked if we'd applied for the hospital's financial assistance program. I told her about the GoFundMe, about the family fund, about how Brandon was managing everything. She nodded slowly, something unreadable crossing her face. She asked if I'd checked the account balance recently. I hadn't. I'd been too consumed with blood counts and platelet transfusions and holding my daughter's hand through waves of nausea so violent she couldn't even keep down water. Janet suggested very carefully that I might want to take a look. Just to be aware, she said. Just to know where things stood. That night, after Emma finally fell asleep around midnight, I opened my bank app for the first time in weeks. The joint account, the Emma Thompson Medical Fund that had held $47,000 from the GoFundMe, plus another $30,000 from our savings, plus countless smaller donations that had come through Venmo and checks, showed a balance of $2,312. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. I refreshed the app, certain there was an error. The number didn't change. $75,000 gone in less than 3 months. I started scrolling through the transaction history, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The transfers out were constant. 2,000 here, 5,000 there, sometimes 3 or 4 transactions in a single day. I didn't recognize the payment descriptions. Personal loan repayment, investment property down payment, vehicle purchase, luxury item retail. Some just said transfer to Brandon Thompson checking. Others said transfer to Tyler Thompson. A few went to accounts I didn't recognize at all. My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I zoomed in on the dates. These transactions had been happening since the second week after the GoFundMe launched. While I sat in a hospital room watching poison drip into my daughter's veins, while I held her hair back as she vomited, while I sang lullabies in the 3 a.m. darkness, my family had been steadily draining the account meant to save her life. I pulled up Instagram, something I hadn't opened in months. Brandon's profile was public, a carefully curated display of his successful life. I scrolled back to the date Emma was diagnosed. In the weeks since, he'd posted photos of a new Tesla, gleaming black in his driveway with the caption "Treating myself to a dream ride." There was a picture from a resort in Hawaii, palm trees and infinity pools, posted just 3 weeks ago while Emma had been in the ICU with a fever and infection that nearly killed her. The caption read, "Sometimes you need to recharge, blessed life." Tyler's profile showed similar patterns. Designer clothes with tags still visible. Bottle service at expensive Seattle nightclubs. A Rolex watch showcased in a photo captioned "Investment in Quality." The dates aligned perfectly with the largest withdrawals from Emma's medical fund. I sat in that darkened hospital room, the smell of antiseptic and the sound of machines breathing for sleeping children, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, crack. Like ice beginning to fracture before it shatters completely. These were the people who'd hugged me at Emma's birthday party, who'd cried with me when we got the diagnosis, who'd stood in this very room and held Emma's small hand and promised her everything would be okay. They'd looked into my daughter's eyes, into the face of a 7-year-old fighting for her life, and they'd stolen from her. They'd stolen her chance at the treatments we needed. They'd stolen the security that let me sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. They'd stolen and smiled and posted photos of their luxuries while Emma lost her hair and her strength and nearly lost her life. The next morning I called the bank. The representative, a young man who sounded fresh out of college, pulled up the account. I asked about the transactions, about whether they required multiple signatures, about any kind of fraud protection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He explained, with the kind of patience reserved for people assumed to be technologically incompetent, that all names on a joint account have equal access and withdrawal rights. Brandon, as a joint account holder, had every legal right to make those transfers. But these were supposed to be for medical expenses, I said, hearing my voice crack. The representative went quiet for a moment. I'm very sorry, he said finally, but the bank can't regulate what joint account holders use funds for. That would be a family matter. A family matter. As if families don't destroy each other. As if the word family means anything when your daughter is dying and your brother is buying a Tesla. I hung up and immediately called Brandon. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text, my fingers jabbing at the screen. We need to talk about the medical fund account. Call me immediately. 3 dots appeared, indicating he was typing. Then they disappeared. No response came. I tried my mother. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice bright and cheerful. How's our Emma girl today? She asked, as if everything were fine, as if the world weren't ending. I asked her if she knew what had happened to the money in the medical fund. Her voice changed instantly, going tight and defensive. Brandon's been managing all that, she said. You should talk to him. I told her I'd tried, that he wasn't answering. She made a non-committal sound. He's very busy with work, Rebecca. You know how hard he works. The implication hung there, unspoken but clear. Unlike you, sitting in a hospital, not contributing, not working, being a burden. I asked her directly if she'd seen Brandon's Instagram, if she'd seen the Tesla and the Hawaii trip. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the hospital sounds in my background and what might have been a television in hers. Finally she spoke, her voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. What Brandon does with his own money is his business. You sound very stressed, Rebecca. Maybe you should rest instead of starting drama. Then she hung up. My own mother hung up on me while I sat in a hospital room with my dying daughter. I stared at the phone, at Emma's name and smiling face on my lock screen. A photo from before the cancer, before everything shattered, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was completely alone. Emma woke up around 9, groggy from the anti-nausea medication. She asked for apple juice in that small hoarse voice that the chemo had given her. I poured it from the plastic pitcher the nurses refilled 3 times a day, added the bendy straw she liked, and held it while she sipped. Her eyes, still that bright blue that matched my own, looked up at me with complete trust. Mommy, she whispered, am I going to get better? The question she asked every few days, the one that tore my heart out every single time. Yes, baby, I told her, smoothing the unicorn beanie over her head. Yes, you're going to get better. We're doing everything we can. Even as I said it, I thought about the empty account, about the treatments we might not be able to afford, about the clinical trial Dr. Park had mentioned that could give Emma a better chance but cost money our insurance wouldn't cover. Dr. Helen Park did her rounds late morning. She was a woman in her 40s, Korean American, with steady hands and a direct manner that I'd come to depend on. She checked Emma's charts, asked about her appetite and pain levels, examined the port in her chest where the chemo went in. After Emma dozed off again, Dr. Park gestured for me to follow her into the hallway. We stood by the window overlooking the Seattle skyline, the Space Needle visible in the distance under gray clouds that threatened rain. She asked how I was holding up, really holding up, with the kind of look that said she already knew the answer wasn't good. I told her everything. About the account, about the missing money, about Brandon and Tyler and the Instagram posts and my mother hanging up on me. I told her while staring out at the city, unable to meet her eyes, ashamed somehow even though I'd done nothing wrong. Dr. Park listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. Rebecca, financial abuse during medical crises is more common than you'd think. I've seen it destroy families. I've seen it cost patients their lives. You need to document everything right now before anything else disappears. She recommended I contact the hospital's legal advocate, that I screenshot every transaction, every Instagram post, every text message. She told me that Emma's treatment wouldn't stop, that the hospital had programs and resources, but that I needed to protect myself and my daughter legally. Her directness, her lack of sugarcoating, was exactly what I needed. Someone finally telling me the truth instead of pretending everything was fine. I spent Emma's nap time that afternoon doing exactly what Dr. Park suggested. I screenshotted every transaction from the medical fund account going back to the day it was opened. I saved every Instagram post from Brandon and Tyler showing their purchases and trips. I went through the family group chat, Emma's Warriors, and saved every message where Brandon had updated everyone on the fund, where people had praised him, where my mother had shut down anyone who asked questions. I found the original GoFundMe page and saved all the donor comments, people pouring their hearts out about wanting to help a little girl fight cancer, never knowing their money was funding a Tesla and a Hawaiian vacation. I created a folder on my phone labeled Evidence, and I backed everything up to the cloud. Then I opened a new note and started writing down everything I could remember. Every conversation with Brandon about the account. Every time he'd reassured me not to worry about money. Every time my mother had told me to let him handle it, that I was too stressed to think clearly. I wrote down the dates Emma had been in the ICU, the dates of her worst chemo reactions, and I cross-referenced them with Brandon's Instagram posts. While Emma had been fighting for her life with a 104-degree fever, Brandon had been on a beach in Maui. While she'd been getting a platelet transfusion because her counts had dropped so low she was at risk of bleeding to death, Tyler had been showing off his new Rolex. The pattern was undeniable, documented, impossible to explain away. Michael came by after work, still in his construction clothes, smelling of sawdust and sweat. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes that matched my own. He'd been working overtime every week, picking up extra shifts, doing anything to bring in more money. I showed him everything on my phone. The account balance. The transaction history. The Instagram posts. I watched his face change as he scrolled. Watched the disbelief turn to anger, turn to something darker and more dangerous. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor loud enough to make Emma stir in her sleep. "I'm going to kill him," Michael said quietly. "I'm going to drive to his house right now and kill him." I grabbed his arm, pulled him back down. We couldn't afford for him to end up in jail. We needed him working. We needed his insurance. We needed to be smart about this, not emotional, even though every cell in my body wanted to scream and break things and make someone hurt the way we were hurting. We sat together in the dimness of Emma's room and made a plan. Michael would go to the bank in person first thing Monday morning and remove. His name wasn't on the joint account, but mine was, and I'd remove myself and close it if possible, salvaging whatever was left. I'd contact a lawyer, someone who dealt with financial fraud. We'd report it to the police if necessary, family or not. We'd tell everyone who donated to the GoFundMe exactly where their money had gone. We'd burn it all down if that's what it took to get justice for Emma. For the first time in months, sitting in that hospital room planning our counterattack, I felt something besides helpless despair. I felt anger, clean and sharp and energizing. They'd stolen from the wrong mother. The Seattle rain started just after midnight, that persistent drizzle that turns the city into a watercolor painting of gray and shadow. I stood at the window of Emma's hospital room, watching droplets race down the glass while she slept fitfully behind me. The morphine they'd given her for the bone pain kept her under, but even in sleep her small face was pinched with discomfort. Michael had gone home an hour ago, reluctant but necessary. He had to be at the construction site by 6 a.m., and someone needed to feed our cat, water the plants, maintain the illusion that we still had a normal life waiting for us somewhere outside these walls. My phone sat on the narrow windowsill, screen dark but somehow still menacing. I'd turned off notifications for the family group chat hours ago, but I could see the red badge climbing higher with each passing hour. 43 unread messages. I didn't need to open it to know what they said. My mother would be trying to smooth things over, painting me as hysterical and overwrought. Brandon would be defensive, probably claiming misunderstandings about investments and loans. Aunt Diane would be playing peacemaker, suggesting we all just focus on Emma and deal with financial matters later. Later, as if my daughter had the luxury of time while her treatment fund evaporated. I picked up the phone and opened my email instead. 3 responses had come in from lawyers I'd contacted through the hospital's legal advocacy program. 2 were polite declinations, explaining they didn't handle family financial disputes. The 3rd was from a woman named Victoria Brennan, whose email signature listed her as specializing in elder abuse and financial exploitation. Her message was brief and direct. What happened to your daughter's medical fund constitutes financial abuse, regardless of family relationship. I have availability Tuesday at 10 a.m. if you'd like to discuss options. Bring all documentation. My chest loosened slightly. Someone was taking this seriously. Someone besides Michael and Dr. Park believed me. Emma stirred around 2 a.m., whimpering softly. I was at her bedside before she fully woke, smoothing the unicorn beanie that had shifted in her sleep. Her eyes opened, unfocused and glassy with medication. The port site in her chest was bothering her again. I could see the redness even in the dim light, the skin around it inflamed and angry. I pressed the call button for the nurse. Within minutes, Denise appeared, a night shift veteran who moved with efficient calm. She checked Emma's temperature, examined the port, made notes in the chart. Slight fever, she said quietly. We'll keep monitoring. Could just be irritation from today's infusion, but Dr. Park will want to know first thing. After Denise left, I climbed carefully onto the hospital bed beside Emma, something the nurses technically discouraged but never actually stopped. She curled against me, her body so much smaller than it should be, the chemo stealing her appetite along with everything else. She smelled like hospital soap, and something metallic I'd learned was the scent of the medications coming through her pores. "Mommy," she whispered, her breath warm against my neck. "Are you sad?" The question startled me. I'd been so careful to smile around her, to project confidence and optimism, to never let her see the terror that lived in my chest like a second heart. "I'm just tired, baby," I told her. "But I'm not sad when I'm with you." She was quiet for a moment, her small hand finding mine. "Tyler didn't come see me anymore," she said. "And Uncle Brandon promised to bring me a present, but he never did." The observation landed like a physical blow. Emma had noticed. Of course she'd noticed. Children notice everything, especially when they're spending endless hours in a hospital bed with nothing to do but observe the adults around them. I wanted to tell her the truth, to explain that Uncle Brandon was a thief and Tyler was complicit, and her grandmother had chosen money over her granddaughter's life. But she was 7 years old with cancer, and she didn't need that weight added to everything else she was carrying. "They've been really busy with work," I said, the lie tasting bitter. "But I'm here and Daddy's here and we're not going anywhere." She accepted this with the kind of easy trust that made my throat tight. "'Kay," she said. "As long as you don't leave." "Never," I promised. "Never ever." Monday morning arrived with weak sunshine that did nothing to warm the November air. Michael picked me up at 8, and we drove to the Bank of America branch in downtown Seattle, where Brandon had opened the Emma Thompson Medical Fund account. I'd barely slept, running through scenarios in my mind. What if they wouldn't let me access the account information? What if Brandon had somehow removed my name? What if the remaining $2,000 had vanished overnight? Michael reached over and squeezed my hand as we pulled into the parking garage. His knuckles were scraped from work, his fingers calloused and strong. "We've got this," he said. "Document everything. Stay calm. Get facts." The bank was sleek and modern, all glass and polished marble that echoed our footsteps. A young woman in a navy suit greeted us with a professional smile that faltered slightly when she saw my face. I probably looked like exactly what I was, a woman who'd been living in a hospital for 3 months, who'd slept in chairs and survived on vending machine coffee and the kind of fear that hollows you out from the inside. I explained why we were there, keeping my voice level. I needed information about the joint account, transaction history, everything. She led us to a private office and logged into her computer. The account manager who joined us 10 minutes later was a man in his 50s named Robert Chen. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the careful demeanor of someone who delivered bad financial news many times before. He pulled up the account on his screen, and I watched his expression shift as he scrolled through the transaction history. "How long has this account been open?" he asked. 3 months, I told him. "Since late July." He nodded slowly, still scrolling. "And you're aware of all these withdrawals?" I told him I'd only just discovered them, that the account was supposed to be used exclusively for my daughter's medical expenses, that I'd been at the hospital full-time and hadn't been monitoring it. Robert Chun printed out the complete transaction history, 6 pages of withdrawals that painted an undeniable picture. He explained that with a joint account, any holder could make withdrawals without other holders' knowledge or permission. But he also noted something I hadn't known. Several of the larger transfers had been flagged internally for potential fraud, but since they came from a joint account holder, the bank's fraud department had cleared them. "Your brother," he said carefully, "called our fraud line 3 times to confirm his authorization for transfers. He was quite insistent that these were legitimate medical expenses." The words hung in the air between us. Brandon hadn't just stolen. He'd anticipated that someone might catch him and had proactively covered his tracks. I asked if there was any way to reverse the transfers to reclaim the money. Robert's expression told me the answer before he spoke. Once funds are transferred from a joint account with proper authorization, they can't be reversed by the bank. Your recourse would be civil court or potentially criminal fraud charges, but that's outside our jurisdiction. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. Off the record, Mrs. Thompson, I've seen this before. Family members exploiting medical crises. It's more common than people realize, and it's devastating. Document everything. Get a lawyer. And close this account today. I can help you open a new account in your name, only, and transfer the remaining balance. We did exactly that. The new account, the Emma Thompson medical account, held $2,108. That was what remained of $75,000 in donations, savings, and liquidated assets. $2,000 to cover the treatments that would cost hundreds of thousands. Michael's hand was shaking as he signed the paperwork. I watched the muscle in his jaw clench and release. The only outward sign of the rage I knew was building inside him. Robert Chun printed everything, placed it in a folder, and handed it to me with genuine sympathy in his eyes. I hope your daughter recovers, he said. And I hope you get justice. In the car, Michael didn't start the engine. He just sat gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the concrete wall of the parking garage. $73,000, he finally said. They stole $73,000 from our daughter. From Emma. His voice broke on her name. I didn't trust myself to speak. If I opened my mouth, I thought I might start screaming and never stop. Instead, I opened the folder Robert had given us and started photographing every page with my phone. Evidence. Documentation. The foundation of whatever came next. My appointment with Victoria Brennan was at her office in Capitol Hill, a converted Victorian house that had been transformed into a law practice. She met us in a conference room with exposed brick walls and tall windows that let in gray afternoon light. Victoria was perhaps 60, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that assessed everything. She listened while I walked through the timeline, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. She asked direct questions. Had Brandon ever had legal power of attorney? No. Had I explicitly authorized any of the withdrawals? No. Did I have documentation of the account's intended purpose? Yes, the GoFundMe page clearly stated it was for Emma's medical expenses, and I had screenshots of every donor comment. Victoria leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the pad. This is financial exploitation and fraud, she said without preamble. The joint account complicates criminal prosecution because technically he had legal access, but the misrepresentation of the fund's purpose, especially given the GoFundMe's explicit terms, creates civil liability at minimum. She outlined options. We could file a civil lawsuit for recovery of funds plus damages. We could report to the police and let them determine if criminal charges were appropriate. We could do both. Each path had costs, both financial and emotional. A civil suit could take years and cost thousands in legal fees we didn't have. Criminal charges might move faster but had a lower likelihood of financial recovery. What do most people do in this situation, I asked. Victoria's expression softened slightly. Most people do nothing, she said. The shame and family pressure are too much. They convince themselves it's not worth destroying relationships, even though those relationships already destroyed them. She paused. But you're not here asking if you should do something. You're here asking how to do it most effectively. I appreciated her directness, the way she didn't sugarcoat or condescend. Yes, I said. I want every option that gets my daughter's money back, and makes sure he faces consequences. We spent the next hour going through everything I documented. Victoria photographed the bank statements, the Instagram posts, the text messages. She had me write out a detailed timeline, matching dates of Emma's medical crises with dates of Brandon's luxury purchases. She asked about other family members' involvement. Had my mother known? Had she participated in the withdrawals? I told her about my mother's defensive reaction, about how she'd shut down the conversation and hung up on me. Victoria made a note. Potential co-conspirator or enabler at minimum, she said. We'll need to determine her level of knowledge and involvement. As we were wrapping up, Victoria asked me a question I hadn't expected. How is Emma doing? Not the medical specifics, but how is she? I found myself answering honestly in a way I hadn't with anyone except Michael. She's scared. She's in pain most of the time. She doesn't understand why her hair fell out or why she has to stay in the hospital or why the medicine makes her so sick. But she still smiles when her favorite nurse comes in. She still wants to hear stories before bed. She's still fighting. Victoria nodded slowly. Then we fight too, she said. For her. I'll prepare a demand letter to your brother first, giving him 10 days to return the funds before we file suit. Sometimes the formal legal approach shakes loose quick settlements. But be prepared for this to get ugly. Family financial cases always do. Michael had to go back to work, but I couldn't face returning to the hospital yet. I drove to Cary Park, the overlook that gives you the postcard view of Seattle's skyline. The afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of November day where you can see Mount Rainier in the distance. I sat on a bench and finally opened the family group chat that had been blowing up my phone for 2 days. 67 unread messages now. I scrolled to the beginning and read through them all. My mother had indeed tried to control the narrative. Rebecca is having a breakdown from stress. We need to give her space and not engage with her accusations. Brandon needs our support during this difficult time. Brandon's messages were a masterclass in manipulation. I've been working so hard to manage everything while Becca focuses on Emma. I may have made some accounting errors, but everything was intended for the family's benefit. I'm hurt that my own sister would attack me during such a traumatic time. Tyler had jumped in with his own defense. Uncle Brandon has been nothing but generous. Some people can't handle stress and lash out at those trying to help. Aunt Diane had posted prayer hands emojis and messages about family forgiveness. Uncle Frank had stayed silent, but there were just a few dissenting voices. A cousin I barely knew, Ashley, had written, I think we should at least look at the account records before dismissing Rebecca's concerns. My mother had shut that down immediately. This is not up for group discussion. Brandon will handle it privately with Rebecca. Another family friend who was in the chat had posted, I donated to Emma's GoFundMe specifically for her treatment. I'd like to know those funds are being used as intended. That message had been met with silence, pointedly ignored by everyone. I typed out a message, my fingers moving before I could overthink it. I went to the bank today. I have complete transaction records. $73,000 was withdrawn from Emma's medical fund for personal expenses including a Tesla, a Hawaii vacation, designer purchases, and other non-medical costs. I have documentation of everything. I've consulted with a lawyer. This is fraud and financial exploitation. Anyone who contributed to the GoFundMe or donated money for Emma's treatment deserves to know their money was stolen. I hit send and watched the 3 dots appear almost immediately as people started typing responses. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. My mother called within 30 seconds. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. A text came through. How dare you air family business in a group chat? You're being vindictive and cruel. Brandon called next. I answered this time, putting it on speaker so I could record it. Rebecca, he started, his voice smooth and reasonable. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. Those withdrawals were authorized investments meant to grow the medical fund. I was trying to help. The lie was so brazen I almost laughed. Investments, I said flatly. A Tesla is an investment? A vacation is an investment? Tyler's Rolex is an investment? His tone shifted, became harder. You're not thinking clearly. The stress of Emma's situation has obviously affected your judgment. I was managing complex financial instruments that you wouldn't understand. You should have trusted me instead of going behind my back to lawyers and making accusations. The gaslighting was textbook, almost impressive in its audacity. I have bank records, Brandon, I said. I have your Instagram posts. I have dates and amounts and screenshots of everything. Your lawyer will be receiving a demand letter later this week. If the money isn't returned within 10 days, I'm filing a civil suit and reporting you to the police for fraud. The pause that followed was long and loaded. When he spoke again, the reasonable mask had dropped completely. You're going to regret this, he said quietly. You're going to destroy this family over money? While Emma is sick. What kind of mother are you? The question hit exactly where he'd aimed it. The guilt and shame every parent of a sick child carries. But I'd been living in a pediatric oncology ward for 3 months. I'd watched other parents fight battles that made mine look simple. I'd learned that sometimes love means being the villain in someone else's story. The kind of mother who protects her daughter, I said. Even from her own family. especially from her own family. I hung up before he could respond. The group chat had erupted into chaos. Some people were demanding to see the bank records. Others were defending Brandon, claiming I was having a mental breakdown. My mother posted that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings until I apologized and dropped these horrible accusations. Aunt Diane was trying to organize a family meeting to discuss everything calmly and rationally. Uncle Frank finally broke his silence with a single sentence. If what Rebecca says is true, Brandon needs to return the money and face consequences. It was the first time anyone in my family had publicly acknowledged I might be telling the truth. My phone rang again. Not a family member this time, but a Seattle area code I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. Is this Rebecca Thompson? The voice was female, professional. This is Amanda Pierce from Cairo 7 News. I'm a reporter covering medical fundraising fraud. A source forwarded me your GoFundMe page and some concerning information about misused donations. I'd like to speak with you about your daughter's case. My breath caught. Someone had gone to the media. Someone had decided this story needed to be told publicly. I don't know, I started. This is a family matter. Ms. Thompson, Amanda interrupted gently. Dozens of people donated their hard-earned money believing it would help a child with cancer. If those funds were misappropriated, that's not a family matter. That's a public interest story. People deserve to know what happened to their donations. She was right. Every person who'd contributed to Emma's GoFundMe, every stranger who'd sent money with heartfelt messages about hoping she'd recover, they'd been lied to. They'd been told their donations would provide life-saving treatment, and instead their money had bought luxury goods for my brother and nephew. I told Amanda I needed to think about it, that I'd call her back. She gave me her direct number and said she understood this was difficult, but that sunshine was the best disinfectant. Exposure often led to accountability when family pressure and shame kept victims silent. I sat in that park overlooking the city as the afternoon faded into evening, watching lights begin to flicker on across Seattle. Somewhere in one of those buildings was the hospital where Emma was probably waking up from her afternoon nap, asking for me. Somewhere else was Brandon's house with the Tesla in the driveway, bought with money meant to save a child's life. I thought about Victoria Brennan's question about what most people do in this situation. Most do nothing. Most let shame and family loyalty silence them. Most choose peace over justice because fighting is exhausting and expensive and uncertain. But I thought about Emma asking why Tyler didn't visit anymore. About her small voice wondering if she'd get better. About her trust that the adults in her life were doing everything possible to save her. I thought about every parent in that pediatric oncology ward fighting their own impossible battles. About the families I'd met who'd lost everything trying to save their children. I thought about the strangers who donated their money in good faith, believing they were helping a little girl fight cancer. They deserved to know the truth. Emma deserved to have someone fight for her as hard as she was fighting to survive. I called Amanda Pierce back and told her I'd talk to her, but only if we could do it at the hospital. I wanted Emma's reality to be part of the story. I wanted people to see what their donations were supposed to support, what Brandon's theft had threatened. Amanda agreed immediately. We scheduled it for Wednesday morning, when Emma would be alert and between treatments. I'd have Michael there for support, and Dr. Park had already agreed to provide medical context if needed. This was happening. I was going to tell the world what my family had done, and there would be no coming back from it. The drive back to the hospital felt different somehow, like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. My phone continued buzzing with messages, voicemails, texts from family members begging me to reconsider, threatening me, trying to guilt me into silence. I turned it off completely. Let them panic. Let them scramble. Let them feel a fraction of the fear and helplessness I'd felt watching my daughter suffer while they stole from her. When I walked back into Emma's room, she was awake and watching cartoons, her dinner tray untouched beside her. She smiled when she saw me, that smile that was missing a front tooth and lit up her whole face despite everything. "Mommy, you're back," she said. I was back. And I wasn't backing down. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a Pacific Northwest storm system moves through. I'd barely slept, running through what I'd say to the camera, how much of Emma's medical reality I should expose, whether I was doing the right thing by making this public. Michael had taken the morning off work, something we couldn't afford but he'd insisted on. He arrived at the hospital at 8:30 carrying 2 decent coffees from the Starbucks down the street. Not the sludge from the hospital cafeteria that I'd been surviving on for months. Emma was having a good morning, relatively speaking. Her fever had broken overnight, and she'd managed to eat half a container of applesauce for breakfast. The child life specialist had brought her a new coloring book, and she was working on a picture of a butterfly with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly the way it always did when she focused. She'd asked why the news people were coming, and I'd explained as simply as I could that we needed to tell people about what happened to the money that was supposed to help her get better. She'd accepted this with a child's easy logic. Because Uncle Brandon took it, she said matter-of-factly. I'd frozen at her words, realizing she'd understood far more than I'd given her credit for. Yes, baby, I said. Because Uncle Brandon took it, and that wasn't okay. Amanda Pierce arrived at 9 with a cameraman named Joel who moved with practiced efficiency, setting up lights and checking angles while keeping his equipment away from the medical machinery. Amanda herself was younger than she'd sounded on the phone, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and intelligent eyes that took in everything. She shook my hand firmly, then Michael's, before crouching down to Emma's level. Hi Emma, she said gently. I'm Amanda. I love your butterfly. Is it okay if we talk while you color? Emma nodded shyly, clearly uncertain about the strangers in camera, but trusting that I'd allowed them here for a reason. We started with the basics. Amanda asked about Emma's diagnosis, the treatment protocol, the prognosis. Dr. Park had provided written medical summaries that I could reference without violating privacy laws. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia diagnosed in April. Aggressive chemotherapy protocol spanning 2 to 3 years. Current complications included infection risks, severe nausea, bone pain, and ongoing monitoring for organ damage from the treatment itself. The medical costs were staggering even with insurance. Copays, out-of-network specialists, medications not covered by our plan, travel expenses for trials we'd considered. We'd estimated needing at least $100,000 beyond what insurance would cover to give Emma the best possible chance. Amanda's questions were direct but not cruel. She asked about the GoFundMe campaign, about how it started and how quickly it grew. I showed her screenshots of the original page, of my father's video, of the donor comments that had poured in. People had given everything from $5 to $5,000. A woman in Ohio who was on disability had sent $20 with a note saying she wished it could be more. A group of elementary school students had held a bake sale and raised $347. Every donation had come with messages. Praying for Emma. Stay strong. This is for that beautiful little girl. No one should have to choose between their child's life and bankruptcy. Then I showed her the bank records. All 6 pages of transaction history, the systematic draining of the account that had started within weeks of the GoFundMe launching. Amanda's expression remained professional, but I saw something flash in her eyes. Anger, maybe, or the recognition of a story that mattered. She asked if she could photograph the documents. I'd already cleared it with Victoria Brennan, who'd said that once we were pursuing legal action, strategic media exposure could actually work in our favor. Public pressure often accomplished what lawyers couldn't. The hardest part was explaining how I discovered it. Describing that 3 a.m. moment when I checked the bank app and seen $2,000 where there should have been $75,000. The sick realization that had followed. The scrolling through transactions that made no sense. I started crying when I talked about seeing Brandon's Instagram posts, about the Tesla and the Hawaii trip dated to when Emma had been in the ICU with sepsis. Amanda didn't interrupt, just let me talk. Let the emotion be real and raw on camera. Michael's hand found mine, his grip tight enough to hurt, anchoring me. Amanda asked the question I'd been dreading. Why would your own brother do this? Why would any family member steal from a child with cancer? I thought about this constantly over the past few days, trying to understand the psychology of it. Because he could, I said finally. Because the account structure gave him access. Because he's always felt entitled to take what he wants. Because somewhere in his mind he justified it. Maybe he told himself he'd pay it back. Maybe he convinced himself Emma would be fine and the money was just sitting there. Maybe he's just a person who sees an opportunity and takes it without considering the consequences. I don't know if that makes him evil or broken or just fundamentally selfish. But I know what it makes him. A thief who stole from a dying child. The interview lasted almost 2 hours. Amanda asked about my mother's response, about the family group chat messages, about the broader family dynamics that had allowed this to happen. She asked what I wanted to happen next. Justice, I said. I want every dollar returned. I want him prosecuted for fraud. I want everyone who donated to know the truth about what happened to their money. And I want other families to see this story and know they're not alone. Financial abuse during medical crises is hidden because people are ashamed, because we're taught that family loyalty matters more than anything, because we're supposed to forgive and move on. But family isn't supposed to steal from dying children. There's no loyalty in that. There's no love in that. After Amanda and Joel packed up their equipment and left with promises the story would air Friday evening, I felt simultaneously lighter and more terrified than I had in days. There was no taking it back now. By Friday night, potentially hundreds of thousands of people would know what Brandon had done, what my family had done. The privacy I'd been clinging to would be completely gone. Emma asked if she did okay on camera. You were perfect, I told her, smoothing her beanie. You're always perfect. She smiled and went back to her coloring, already moving on the way children do, not understanding that the world was about to shift in ways we couldn't control. Michael stayed until early afternoon, then had to get back to work. A pipe had burst on his construction site, and they needed all hands to prevent water damage. After he left, I finally turned my phone back on. The message count had climbed past 100. I scrolled through them with a kind of detached fascination. My mother's messages had progressed from angry to pleading to threatening. You're destroying this family. You'll never be forgiven for this betrayal. Think about what you're doing to all of us. Brandon's messages were more calculated. I've consulted with my attorney. If you proceed with these false accusations, I'll have no choice but to sue you for defamation. You're opening yourself up to serious legal consequences. The defamation threat almost made me laugh. Truth was an absolute defense against defamation, and I had bank records, screenshots, and a paper trail that would make any lawyer salivate. Brandon wasn't threatening to sue because he thought he'd win. He was threatening because it was the last card he had to play, one final attempt to scare me into silence. I forwarded his message to Victoria Brennan with a note asking if I needed to be concerned. Her response came back within minutes. Empty threat. He knows he's caught. Document all threats and harassment. They'll support our case. The family group chat had splintered. Some people had left entirely. Others had formed a smaller chat without me, or so I'd heard from Ashley, who'd reached out privately to say she believed me and was horrified by what Brandon had done. Ashley was my father's brother's daughter, someone I'd seen at holidays but never been particularly close to. Her support felt simultaneously validating and surreal. Why do you believe me? I asked her over text. Everyone else seems convinced I'm lying or crazy. Her response was simple. As I've watched Brandon my whole life. He's always taken what he wanted and never faced consequences. And because your evidence is undeniable, I'm sorry the rest of the family can't see that. I'm sorry you're going through this alone. But I wasn't entirely alone. Messages had started coming in from people outside the family. GoFundMe donors who'd seen my post in the family chat, which someone had apparently leaked or shared. I'm the woman from Ohio who sent $20, one message read. I'm on disability and that was my grocery money for 2 days. Please tell me you're going to make him pay it back. Another came from the mother who'd organized the elementary school bake sale. Those kids worked so hard because they wanted to help Emma. They deserved to know their money went where they intended. The messages weren't angry at me. They were angry for me, for Emma, for the violation of trust that Brandon's theft represented. I responded to each one personally, thanking them for their donation, apologizing that their generosity had been exploited, promising I was doing everything possible to recover the funds and hold Brandon accountable. Several people offered to write statements for the lawyer or testify if needed. A few asked if there was a new secure fundraiser they could contribute to. The outpouring of support from strangers while my own family tried to silence and shame me was a study in contrast that I'd think about for years to come. Thursday passed in a blur of medical procedures and legal preparations. Emma had a spinal tap to check for leukemia cells in her cerebrospinal fluid, a procedure that required sedation and left her groggy and uncomfortable for hours afterward. I held her hand through the prep, sang to her as the anesthesia took effect, and was there when she woke up crying and disoriented. These were the moments that Brandon's theft felt most visceral. While I comforted my daughter through another painful procedure, he was presumably going about his normal day, showing houses to clients, maybe having lunch at some trendy restaurant, completely insulated from the consequences of his actions. Victoria Brennan called late afternoon with an update. The demand letter had been sent via certified mail and email to Brandon, with copies to my parents as potential co-conspirators. She'd laid out the evidence clearly and given him 10 days to return all misappropriated funds plus interest, or face civil litigation and criminal fraud charges. She asked if I was prepared for what might come next. Brandon will likely try to negotiate, she said. He'll offer partial repayment in exchange for dropping charges. He'll try to make it seem generous, like he's doing you a favor. Don't accept anything less than full restitution plus your legal fees. And be prepared for him to play the victim, to claim you're vindictive or punishing him for innocent mistakes. I told her I was prepared, though I wasn't sure that was true. How do you prepare for your family to turn on you completely? How do you ready yourself for the public exposure that was coming? Amanda Pierce had sent me a preview link to the story that would air Friday evening. I'd watched it alone in the hospital bathroom with my earbuds in, seeing myself on camera talking about my daughter's cancer and my brother's betrayal. I looked exhausted and desperate and angry, all of which were true, but I also looked determined. I looked like someone who wouldn't back down. I hoped that was true too. Emma had a bad night Thursday. Her counts had dropped again, making her vulnerable to infection and requiring another transfusion. She spiked a fever around midnight that had the nurses concerned enough to call the oncology resident. They drew blood cultures, started for antibiotics, monitored her closely through the small hours of the morning. I sat beside her bed holding her hand, watching the monitors, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Please don't take her. Please let the antibiotics work. Please let her be okay. The fever broke around 4 a.m., and Emma fell into genuine sleep for the first time in hours. I stayed awake watching her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her chest like a miser counting coins. Friday morning brought nervous energy I couldn't shake. The story would air at 6 p.m. on the evening news. Michael was coming straight from work to watch it with me. Dr. Park had stopped by during morning rounds and asked if I was ready for what might come after the story went public. You'll probably get a lot of attention, she'd said carefully. Some of it will be supportive. Some might not be. People have opinions about families and money, and how these situations should be handled. Try not to read the comments if you can help it. I'd nodded, knowing I'd read every single comment, unable to help myself. The day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Emma was feeling better, the antibiotics having done their job, and the child life specialist took her to the playroom for an hour while I tried to eat something from the cafeteria. The food tasted like cardboard, but I forced it down anyway. My phone was quiet for once, the family having apparently exhausted their arguments or moved their discussion somewhere I couldn't see it. The silence felt ominous rather than peaceful. The calm before whatever storm was coming. Michael arrived at 5:30 with takeout from the Thai place near our apartment, the one we used to go to before Emma got sick, back when we were different people living a different life. We spread the containers across the small table in Emma's room while she dozed in her bed, the steady beep of her monitors providing background rhythm. Neither of us ate much. We were both watching the clock, watching the minutes tick toward 6 p.m. and the point of no return. The story was the lead segment. Amanda's voiceover began over footage of the hospital exterior. When a child is diagnosed with cancer, families often face impossible choices between medical care and financial ruin. Crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe have become lifelines, allowing communities to rally around sick children and their families. But what happens when the money meant to save a life is stolen by the people who are supposed to protect that child most? Then my face filled the screen and I was talking about Emma's diagnosis, about the GoFundMe campaign, about discovering the theft. The editing was tight and powerful, cutting between my interview, the bank documents Amanda had photographed, and screenshots of Brandon's Instagram posts showing his purchases. Amanda's reporting was thorough and damning. She'd done additional research, finding that Brandon had listed the Tesla purchase on social media, the same week he'd transferred $15,000 from Emma's medical fund. She'd matched Tyler's Rolex post to another $5,000 withdrawal. She'd even contacted the Hawaii resort and confirmed Brandon's stay dates, which overlapped exactly with Emma's ICU admission for sepsis. The timeline she'd constructed left no room for misunderstanding or alternate explanations. This wasn't complicated financial management or innocent mistakes. This was systematic theft from a child with cancer. The story included my statement about wanting justice and accountability. It included information about the demand letter and potential legal action. And crucially, it included a statement from GoFundMe's press office saying they took fraud seriously and were reviewing the campaign. They couldn't comment on specific cases, but their terms of service clearly prohibited misuse of donated funds, and violations could result in account suspension and referral to law enforcement. The message was clear. Brandon wasn't just fighting me anymore. He'd drawn attention from a platform that had significant resources to investigate fraud. The story ended with Emma coloring in her hospital bed. Amanda's voiceover gentle but pointed. Emma Thompson continues her fight against leukemia, even as her family fights to recover the money stolen from her medical fund. The Thompsons hope that by sharing their story, other families will feel empowered to speak up when they face similar exploitation. Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't against disease. They're against the people who are supposed to love you most. The screen faded to black, then cut to the news anchors in the studio looking appropriately somber and outraged. Michael and I sat in silence for a long moment after it ended. Emma was still sleeping, oblivious to the fact that her story had just been broadcast to hundreds of thousands of people across the Seattle metro area. My phone, which had been quiet all day, started buzzing immediately. Text messages, voicemails, social media notifications, all flooding in at once. I turned it face down on the table, not ready to deal with whatever was coming. "We did it," Michael said quietly. "It's out there now. Everyone knows." I nodded, feeling oddly disconnected from my body. There was relief in the exposure, in not carrying the secret alone anymore. But there was also terror. I just made my family's ugliest moments public. I just painted a target on my back and Brandon's. There was no way to predict what would come next. The first call I answered was from Victoria Brennan. "I just watched the story," she said, and I could hear approval in her voice. That was exactly what we needed. Public pressure, platform attention, community support. Brandon's going to feel walls closing in from multiple directions now. Be prepared for him to either offer a quick settlement or double down and get aggressive. Either way, we're in a stronger position than we were this morning. She told me to forward any threatening messages directly to her, to document everything, and to try to get some rest. The next few days would likely be intense. The next call was from a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. "Is this Rebecca Thompson?" The voice was older, female, unfamiliar. "This is Margaret Chen. My husband Robert helped you at the bank on Monday. I watched your story tonight, and I want you to know that I donated to a new GoFundMe if you start one. What your brother did is unconscionable. That little girl deserves better." I found myself crying, overwhelmed by the kindness of a complete stranger. "Thank you," I managed. "Thank you so much." Margaret continued, her voice fierce despite her age. "I lost my daughter to cancer 30 years ago. We didn't have GoFundMe back then, but we had family who stepped up and family who disappeared. The ones who helped will never forget. The ones who failed us will never forgive. You fight for your Emma. You fight with everything you have. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting your child." After we hung up, I sat holding my silent phone, Margaret's words echoing in my head. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting your child. That's what I was doing, wasn't it? Not destroying the family, not being vindictive or dramatic or any of the things my mother had accused me of being. I was protecting Emma. I was fighting for her chance at life that Brandon had stolen. I was refusing to be silent about abuse just because it came from inside the family. There was nothing to feel guilty about in that. Social media was exploding. The news station had posted the story on their Facebook page, and the comments section was a mix of outrage on Emma's behalf and armchair legal advice. Someone had already identified Brandon from context clues and found his Instagram, which was now being flooded with angry messages. His account went private within an hour of the story airing. Tyler's account disappeared entirely. People were finding the original GoFundMe page and leaving comments expressing their disgust at the misuse of funds. A few comments defended Brandon, suggesting I was a bitter sister making false accusations, but they were drowned out by hundreds of others expressing support in fury at the theft. By 8 p.m., 3 different lawyers had reached out offering pro bono representation if I wanted to pursue criminal charges in addition to the civil suit. 2 local news stations requested follow-up interviews. Someone had started a Facebook group called Justice for Emma Thompson that already had over 1,000 members. The Seattle Times wanted to do a longer investigative piece. A podcast about medical fraud wanted me as a guest. The attention was overwhelming and surreal. 24 hours ago, this had been my private nightmare. Now it belonged to everyone, dissected and discussed and debated by thousands of strangers. My mother called at 8:30. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with Michael beside me. Her voice was shaking with what might have been rage or tears or both. How could you do this to us? How could you humiliate your family on television? You've destroyed Brandon's reputation, his business, everything he's worked for. Over money. Over a misunderstanding. You're vindictive and cruel, and I don't know who you've become. Don't bother calling back. You're not my daughter anymore. The message ended abruptly, like she'd hung up mid-thought, unable to continue. I played it again, listening more carefully the second time. Not once had she mentioned Emma. Not once had she expressed concern for her granddaughter or acknowledged that the money had been meant for a child's cancer treatment. Her entire focus was on Brandon's reputation, on the family's image, on her own embarrassment at having this exposed publicly. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that my mother had always known, or at least suspected, what Brandon was doing. She'd chosen to protect him over her granddaughter. She'd chosen his comfort over Emma's life. And now that the truth was public, she was choosing to cut me off rather than face her own complicity. I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Victoria Brennan. More evidence of the family's priorities. More proof that this wasn't about misunderstandings or accounting errors. This was about a family system that had always protected its golden child regardless of who got hurt in the process. I'd been raised in that system, taught to smooth things over and keep the peace and not make waves. But Emma's diagnosis had burned away my ability to play that role. When your child is dying, you learn very quickly what actually matters. Family harmony isn't worth anything if it costs your daughter her life. Emma woke up around 9, groggy but asking for ice chips. I helped her sit up slightly, fed her small pieces of ice while telling her about her day, carefully editing out everything about the news story and the fallout. She asked if she could watch a movie, and we put on Moana for probably the 50th time. She knew every word, mouthing along with the songs even when she was too tired to actually sing. Michael stayed until she fell asleep again around 10:30, then kissed us both and headed home to feed the cat and try to sleep himself. He had to work Saturday 12 hours on the construction site to make up for time he'd missed this week. I settled into the vinyl chair that had become my bed, pulling the thin hospital blanket over myself, listening to Emma breathe and the monitors beep their steady reassurance. My phone continued buzzing with notifications, messages of support from people I'd never met, angry comments from family members or their friends, media requests and legal advice and everything in between. I turned off all notifications except calls from Michael or the hospital and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. More fallout probably. Maybe Brandon's response to the demand letter. Potentially more media attention. Definitely more judgment and opinions from people who didn't know us, didn't understand what we were living through. But tonight Emma was stable. Her fever was gone. She was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. And the truth was finally out there. No longer a secret I had to carry alone. Whatever came next, at least I wasn't fighting in the dark anymore. At least people knew what Brandon had done. At least Emma's story had been told. I fell asleep thinking about Margaret Chen's words. You fight for your Emma. You fight with everything you have. That's exactly what I intended to do. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected sunlight streaming through Emma's hospital room window, the kind of November brightness that feels stolen from a different season. Emma was awake early, her appetite better than it had been in weeks. She managed 3 bites of scrambled eggs and half a cup of apple juice, which felt like a victory worth celebrating. The nursing staff was optimistic about her counts, about maybe being able to go home for a few days if the numbers held steady. Home. The word felt foreign after 3 months of living in this room that smelled like disinfectant and recycled air. My phone had been charging on the windowsill overnight, and when I picked it up, the notification count made my stomach drop. 417 new notifications. Text messages, emails, social media mentions, voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. The story had apparently gone beyond local news. Someone had posted it to Reddit, where it had been upvoted thousands of times. Twitter accounts focused on medical fundraising fraud had shared it. A TikTok about Emma's situation had gone viral overnight, with over 2 million views. Our private nightmare had become internet content, dissected and discussed by millions of strangers who felt entitled to opinions about our lives. I started sorting through messages, creating folders in my mind for what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. Victoria Brennan had emailed at 6 a.m. with a brief update. Brandon's attorney had reached out late Friday night requesting a meeting. They wanted to discuss potential settlement terms before the 10-day deadline. Victoria's assessment was blunt. They're scared. The public attention has them scrambling. We meet on our terms at our location with everything documented. Don't accept less than full restitution plus all legal fees and punitive damages. She'd scheduled the meeting for Monday afternoon at her office, with me present but letting her do the talking. The messages from strangers were overwhelming in their support and their rage. A woman in Portland had started a secondary GoFundMe specifically to cover our legal fees, and it had already raised $12,000 overnight. People were sharing their own stories of family financial abuse, of being exploited during medical crises, of the shame and silence that came with being victimized by people who were supposed to love you. One message stood out from the others. My name is Dr. James Patterson. I'm an oncologist at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I've been practicing for 30 years and I cannot tell you how common this is. Family members stealing from sick children, exploiting medical crises for personal gain. You did the right thing by going public. You gave voice to something that happens in shadows. Thank you for your courage. The family messages were predictably hostile. My mother had sent a series of increasingly unhinged texts throughout the night. You've ruined everything. The church is talking about us. Your father is humiliated. Brandon might lose his real estate license over this. How can you live with yourself? Aunt Diane had written a long message about forgiveness and Christian values, about how families should work through conflicts privately, about how I was setting a terrible example for Emma by teaching her that revenge was acceptable. The manipulation was so transparent it would have been funny if it weren't so enraging. I was setting an example for Emma, all right? I was teaching her that no one, not even family, gets to abuse you without consequences. But there were a few messages that caught me off guard. Uncle Frank, who'd spoken up once in the family group chat, had sent a private text. I believe you. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I've watched Brandon get away with things his whole life because your mother protected him. It was wrong then and it's wrong now. If you need someone to testify about family patterns, I will. Ashley had written something similar. Several cousins I barely knew had reached out to say they'd had their own uncomfortable experiences with Brandon over money, loans that were never repaid, investment opportunities that turned out to be scams, always operating in gray areas where he couldn't quite be called out without causing family drama. Michael arrived mid-morning with clean clothes for me, and a stuffed elephant for Emma that played lullabies when you squeezed its foot. Emma was delighted, clutching it to her chest and making it play the same song on repeat until even she got tired of it. Michael looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd slept about as well as I had. We need to talk, he said quietly, glancing at Emma who was absorbed in her new toy. We stepped out into the hallway, finding a quiet corner near the family waiting room. A fundraiser, he said without preamble. People want to help. The one someone started for legal fees is already over $15,000. But we need one. For Emma's actual medical expenses, something secure that Brandon can't touch. I'd been thinking the same thing but had been afraid to seem opportunistic, like I was exploiting Emma's situation for money. Michael read my hesitation accurately. This isn't about taking advantage, he said firmly. People want to help Emma. They're angry about what Brandon did and they want to make it right. We need the money, Becca. Even if we get everything back from Brandon, and that's a big if, we're still going to be drowning in medical debt. This is about giving Emma every chance we can. He was right. Pride didn't pay for experimental treatments or specialist consultations, or the 1,000 small expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. I nodded slowly. Okay, but we do it completely transparently. Every dollar accounted for. Regular updates on how it's used. I won't become what Brandon is. Michael set it up that afternoon, a new GoFundMe with the title Help Emma Thompson Fight Leukemia Second Chance. The description was careful and detailed, explaining what had happened to the first campaign, providing links to the news story for verification, outlining exactly what the funds would be used for. Medical treatments not covered by insurance. Prescription medications. Travel expenses for specialist consultations. Emergency expenses related to complications. We included recent photos of Emma in her hospital bed, careful to show her reality without exploiting her suffering. Within an hour of posting it, we'd raised $7,000. Within 3 hours, $20,000. By evening, the fund had passed $50,000, surpassing what we'd lost from the original campaign. The comments on the new GoFundMe were a mix of heartwarming and heartbreaking. People who donated to the first campaign were donating again, angrier now but still committed to helping Emma. New donors were contributing with messages about their own family betrayals, their own medical struggles, their own experiences with exploitation. A group of nurses from a hospital in Texas had pooled their money and donated $500 with a note that said, "We see families torn apart by medical bills every day. This one is for Emma and for every patient whose family failed them." I read the comments until I couldn't see through tears, overwhelmed by the generosity of strangers, while my own family had stolen from my daughter. Sunday brought a different kind of attention. The Seattle Times published their investigative piece, a long-form article that went deeper than the television news story. They'd interviewed fraud experts about the prevalence of crowdfunding theft, spoken with GoFundMe representatives about their anti-fraud measures, and somehow gotten comments from several people who donated to Emma's original campaign. The article painted a picture of systemic issues, of how medical crowdfunding had created new opportunities for exploitation, of families torn apart by the financial stress of serious illness. Brandon and my mother were named directly, along with details about the withdrawals and timeline that made their actions undeniable. The Times article also included something I hadn't expected. They'd researched Brandon's background and found 2 previous instances of financial irregularity. A former business partner who'd filed a lawsuit alleging Brandon had misappropriated company funds, settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement. A client complaint filed with the Real Estate Licensing Board about unauthorized use of escrow funds, resolved with a reprimand but no license suspension. The pattern the reporters uncovered suggested this wasn't an isolated incident or a moment of weakness. This was who Brandon was, someone who'd been taking money that wasn't his for years, always managing to avoid serious consequences because of settlements and NDAs and family protection. My mother called Sunday afternoon. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Maybe curiosity about what she'd say after the Times article. Maybe hope that she'd finally acknowledge what Brandon had done. Maybe just exhaustion from carrying anger that was starting to feel heavier than the grief. Her voice when she spoke was different from the raging voicemails, quieter but somehow more cutting. "The article made us look like criminals," she said. "Like we're bad people. Your father is talking about leaving me. The church asked me to step down from the women's ministry leadership. Our neighbors won't make eye contact. You did this. You destroyed us." The accusation hung in the air between us, absurd in its inversion of responsibility. "I destroyed you," I repeated slowly. "Not Brandon, who stole from his dying niece. Not you, who chose to protect him instead of Emma. Me, for telling the truth about what happened." My mother's voice went hard. "You could have handled this privately. You didn't need to involve the media, the lawyers, strangers on the internet. You wanted to humiliate us. You wanted revenge." The conversation was pointless, I realized. She would never accept responsibility. She would never admit that protecting Brandon at Emma's expense was wrong. She'd rewritten the narrative in her mind where I was the villain and they were the victims, and no amount of evidence would change that. "I'm going to hang up now," I told her. "And I don't want you to call again unless it's to apologize to Emma. Not to me, to Emma. For failing to protect her. For letting her uncle steal from her. For choosing Brandon over your granddaughter. Until you can do that, we have nothing to say to each other." I ended the call before she could respond, my hand shaking as I set the phone down. Emma was watching me from her bed, the stuffed elephant clutched in her arms. "Was that Grandma?" she asked. I nodded. "Is she still mad at you?" Emma's perception was sharp despite her age, despite the medications that sometimes made her foggy. "Yes, baby," I said. "She's still mad." Emma considered this for a moment. "That's okay," she said finally. "I'm not mad at you. You're the best, Mommy." The simple declaration from my 7-year-old daughter meant more than any vindication from the family ever could. Monday morning brought the settlement meeting. Michael took the day off work despite our desperate need for his paycheck. Victoria Brennan had insisted I have support present, even though I wouldn't be doing the talking. We met at her office an hour before Brandon and his attorney were scheduled to arrive. Victoria walked us through what to expect. "They'll try to frame this as a misunderstanding," she said. "They'll offer partial repayment and ask you to sign an NDA and release of liability. They want to make this go away quietly. We're going to counter with full restitution of $73,000 plus $10,000 in interest and penalties, plus all legal fees to date, plus a written admission of wrongdoing that you can share publicly. They won't agree to everything, but we start high and negotiate down." Brandon arrived exactly on time with an attorney named Philip Grayson, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of confidence that comes from winning cases most people can't afford to fight. Brandon looked terrible, I was startled to notice. He'd lost weight, his suit hanging loose on his frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his usual confident posture had collapsed into something defeated. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered Emma in her hospital bed, remembered the Tesla in his driveway bought with money meant to save her life, and the sympathy evaporated. The meeting was tense and formal. We sat on opposite sides of Victoria's conference table, the late morning light cutting harsh shadows across everyone's faces. Philip Grayson opened with exactly the approach Victoria had predicted. "My client acknowledges there were some irregularities in the management of the medical fund. He deeply regrets any misunderstanding about the intended use of those funds. In the interest of family harmony and his niece's well-being, he's prepared to offer a settlement of $30,000 in exchange for a full release of all claims and a mutual non-disclosure agreement." The offer was insulting, less than half of what he'd stolen, with conditions that would prevent me from ever telling anyone the truth. Victoria responded without hesitation. "Your client didn't manage funds irregularly. He stole $73,000 from a child with cancer through systematic fraud over a period of 3 months. We have bank records, social media evidence, and witness testimony documenting exactly how he spent money donated for medical care on personal luxury purchases. $30,000 doesn't begin to address the harm caused. Our counteroffer is full restitution of $73,000 plus $10,000 in penalties and interest, payment of all legal fees incurred to date, and a written statement acknowledging misappropriation of funds that Mrs. Thompson is free to share as she sees fit. Payment must be received within 14 days, or we proceed with civil litigation and criminal fraud charges." Philip Grayson's expression didn't change, but something flickered in Brandon's eyes. Fear maybe, or the realization that this wasn't going to be easy. The attorney countered with $45,000 in standard confidentiality provisions. Victoria held firm at $73,000 plus penalties, no NDA. The negotiation continued for over an hour, numbers and terms thrown back and forth across the table like weapons. I sat silent beside Victoria, watching Brandon avoid my eyes, watching him squirm as his attorney fought a battle that was increasingly unwinnable. The public attention had destroyed any leverage he might have had. Everyone knew what he'd done. An NDA was worthless when the truth was already public record. Finally, Philip Grayson asked for a private consultation with his client. They stepped out into the hallway, leaving Michael and me alone with Victoria. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "They're going to accept something close to full restitution," she said. "They have no choice. The criminal fraud threat is real and he knows it. The only question is whether he can liquidate enough to pay quickly, or if we need to structure payments. Either way, you're getting your money back." The words felt surreal. After everything, after the theft and betrayal and public battle, we might actually win. We might actually get Emma's medical fund restored. Brandon and Philip returned 20 minutes later. Brandon's face was gray, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. Philip spoke for him. My client will agree to restitution of $73,000, payment of $5,000 in legal fees, and a brief written acknowledgement of misuse of funds. He cannot pay the full amount immediately, but can provide $30,000 within 2 weeks, and the remainder in monthly installments of $5,000 over 9 months. All payments will be verified and documented. In exchange, Mrs. Thompson agrees not to pursue criminal charges, and both parties release all future claims related to this matter. The NDA demand had been dropped entirely. They knew it was pointless. Victoria looked at me for the first time since the meeting started, a silent question in her eyes. I thought about the numbers, about $30,000 immediately versus waiting for a settlement through court that could take years. I thought about Emma's medical needs, about the bills that didn't stop accumulating just because we were fighting with family. I thought about the new GoFundMe that had already exceeded our expectations, but still couldn't cover everything we'd need over the years of treatment ahead. I nodded slightly. Victoria turned back to Philip. We accept with one modification. The written acknowledgement must specify that funds were taken from a campaign for a child's cancer treatment, and Mrs. Thompson retains the right to share that statement publicly. If Mr. Thompson agrees to these terms, we have a settlement. The actual signing took another 30 minutes, lawyers being lawyers about specific wording and contingencies. Brandon signed the settlement agreement without speaking, his hand shaking slightly as he put his signature on each page. When it was done, Philip Grayson collected his copies and stood to leave. Brandon stood too, then hesitated, looking at me directly for the first time since the meeting started. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it would matter this much. I thought there would be enough. I didn't mean to hurt Emma." The apology was pathetic and inadequate in years too late. I stared at him, this man I'd grown up with, who taught me to ride a bike and defended me from bullies in elementary school, and somewhere along the way had turned into someone who could steal from a dying child. "You didn't think it would matter," I said, my voice cold and level. "You didn't think stealing from your niece with cancer would matter. You didn't think the money donated to save her life was important enough to leave alone. The problem isn't that you didn't mean to hurt Emma, Brandon. The problem is that you didn't think about her at all. She was invisible to you. Just like I've always been invisible to you, to Mom, to everyone. We were just resources to be used when convenient." Brandon flinched like I'd struck him. "That's not true," he started, but I cut him off. "Yes, it is. And you proved it every time you transferred money for a car payment or a vacation while Emma was in the ICU fighting for her life. You proved it every time you posted photos of luxury purchases while I was sleeping in a hospital chair wondering if my daughter would survive the night. You proved it by only apologizing now, when you've been caught and exposed and forced to pay consequences. Don't insult me by pretending you actually care." Philip Grayson put a hand on Brandon's arm, steering him toward the door. "We have an agreement," he said firmly. "Let's leave it at that." They left without another word, the door closing behind them with a soft click that felt like punctuation on the end of a relationship. Michael exhaled slowly beside me, tension draining from his shoulders. Victoria started organizing her copies of the agreement, her expression satisfied. $30,000 in 2 weeks, she said. "I'll monitor the account personally to ensure payment arrives as scheduled. If he misses a single installment after that, we file immediately. You won this, Mrs. Thompson. Not just the settlement but the principle. You refused to be silent about abuse just because it came from family. That matters." We left Victoria's office into afternoon sunshine that felt wrong somehow, too bright for how exhausted and raw I felt. Michael wrapped his arm around my shoulders as we walked to the car. "You okay?" he asked. I didn't know how to answer. I just won $73,000 for Emma's medical care. I'd forced Brandon to admit wrongdoing in writing. I'd proven that I wasn't crazy or vindictive or any of the things my family had called me. But I'd also lost my mother, my brother, most of my extended family. I'd had to expose my daughter's suffering to the world to get justice. Nothing about this felt like winning. Emma was having a good day when we got back to the hospital. Her counts were stable enough that Dr. Park was approving a home visit for Thanksgiving, just 3 days away. The holiday I'd been banned from, the dinner I'd been excluded from, suddenly we'd be spending it at our own apartment with just the 3 of us and maybe a few friends who'd stuck by us. Emma was excited about sleeping in her own bed, seeing our cat, eating food that didn't come from a hospital kitchen. We started making plans, talking about what food she might be able to tolerate, what movies we'd watch, how we'd make it special despite everything. The rest of Monday and Tuesday passed in a blur of discharge preparations and medical instructions. Emma needed to check her temperature every 4 hours at home. Any fever over 100.4 required immediate return to the hospital. No crowds, no sick people, careful hand washing. A nurse would visit Wednesday to check her port site and draw blood. We had to be back for her next chemo infusion the following Monday. The list of precautions was long and intimidating, but the prospect of leaving the hospital, even temporarily, felt like oxygen after months of suffocation. Wednesday morning, we packed Emma's things into the small rolling suitcase that had lived under her hospital bed. Her coloring books and the stuffed elephant Michael had brought. The unicorn beanie and the fuzzy blanket from home that smelled wrong after months of hospital laundry. The cards and drawings from friends and strangers that covered her walls. Michael brought the car around to the patient pickup area, and a nurse wheeled Emma down in a wheelchair even though she insisted she could walk. Hospital policy, the nurse explained. We don't take chances with our oncology kids. The drive home felt strange and wonderful and terrifying. Emma pressed her face to the window, marveling at things she hadn't seen in 3 months. The trees were almost bare now, winter settling into Seattle with its gray skies and persistent drizzle. Our apartment building looked shabbier than I remembered. The paint peeling around the windows, the parking lot cracked and uneven. But it was home. Our cat, Muffin, was waiting just inside the door, meowing indignantly about our long absence before deciding to forgive us and rubbing against Emma's legs. Emma burst into tears at the sight of her. Happy tears that turned into exhausted sobs that turned into laughter. We're home, she kept saying. We're really home. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and bright. Michael was up early preparing what we decided to call Thanksgiving light, foods Emma might actually be able to eat. Mashed potatoes without too much butter. Plain turkey breast. Canned cranberry sauce because Emma liked the way it slid out of the can in one solid cylinder. Apple juice instead of wine. It wasn't the elaborate feast advertised in cooking magazines, but it was ours. Just our small broken family in our small shabby apartment, grateful to be together. My phone buzzed around 10 a.m. A notification that $30,000 had been deposited into Emma's new medical fund account. Brandon had paid the first installment exactly on schedule. I showed Michael the notification, and we stood in our tiny kitchen holding each other, crying with relief and exhaustion and the bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting a battle you should never have had to fight. The money wouldn't solve everything. Emma still had years of treatment ahead. We'd still face financial strain and medical complications, and all the uncertainty that comes with childhood cancer. But we had resources now. We had options. We had the security Brandon had stolen, returned because we'd refused to accept that family meant accepting abuse. Emma wanted to watch the Thanksgiving parade on television, a tradition from before she got sick. We settled on the couch together, Emma between Michael and me, Muffin curled on her lap. The parade was ridiculous and wonderful, giant balloons floating down New York City streets, while commentators made cheerful observations about the weather and the performances. Emma was transfixed, her eyes bright despite her exhaustion. During a commercial break, she looked up at me with a question I'd been dreading. Are we going to see Grandma and Uncle Brandon anymore? I chose my words carefully, aware that how I handled this would shape how she understood family and loyalty and forgiveness for the rest of her life. Not right now, baby, I said. They made some choices that hurt us, and until they can understand why that was wrong, we need to keep some distance. But that doesn't mean we don't have family. We have Daddy and me, and we have friends who love you, and we have all the people who helped us when things were hard. Family isn't just about who you're related to. It's about who shows up when things are difficult. Emma considered this seriously. Like the nurses at the hospital, she said. And Michael nodded. Exactly like the nurses at the hospital. The parade gave way to a football game we had no interest in, which gave way to the dinner we'd prepared. Emma managed 3 bites of turkey and a small scoop of mashed potatoes before her appetite failed, but she was smiling. We took a photo together, the 3 of us at our small table with our modest meal. Emma wearing her unicorn beanie and grinning despite everything. Michael posted it to the GoFundMe page with an update. Home for Thanksgiving. Emma's doing well. Incredibly grateful for everyone's support during the hardest season of our lives. Your donations are giving her a fighting chance, and your kindness has sustained us through betrayal and loss. Thank you for being the family we needed when ours failed us." The responses came flooding in within minutes. Messages from donors expressing relief that Emma was home, that the settlement had been reached, that justice had been served at least partially. Someone commented that they'd seen Brandon's real estate listings had been taken down, that apparently his brokerage had quietly let him go after the negative publicity. Another person shared that my mother had been asked to leave her church's leadership committee. The consequences were rippling outward in ways I hadn't anticipated or necessarily wanted. I'd never set out to destroy Brandon's career or my mother's reputation. I just wanted Emma's medical money back. I just wanted acknowledgement that what they'd done was wrong. But as I sat on our worn couch with Emma dozing against my shoulder and Michael cleaning up the kitchen, I realized I didn't regret any of it. Not going public, not fighting back, not refusing to stay silent about abuse just because it came from family. Emma deserved parents who would fight for her without hesitation or shame. She deserved to see that standing up for yourself mattered, even when it was hard, even when it cost relationships, even when it meant becoming the villain in someone else's story. Especially then. The sun was setting over Seattle, painting our small apartment in shades of gold and amber. Emma stirred awake and asked if we could play a game. Something normal and mundane and blessedly ordinary. We pulled out Candyland, her favorite, and set up the board on the coffee table. She drew cards and moved her little gingerbread man along the rainbow path, laughing when she hit the ice cream space, groaning dramatically when she drew a card that sent her backward. Michael made silly voices for the characters. I pretended to be devastated when Emma passed me. We were just a family playing a board game on Thanksgiving, and if you didn't look too closely at the medical supplies stacked in the corner or the port visible beneath Emma's shirt or the exhaustion written in every line of our faces, we could almost pass for normal. Later, after Emma had gone to bed in her own room for the first time in 3 months, Michael and I sat together in the darkness of our living room. We didn't talk much, too tired for words, just held hands and existed in the quiet. My phone lit up with a notification from the new GoFundMe. Another donation had come in, this one from someone named Patricia Thompson. My mother. $200 with no message attached. I stared at the notification for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. An apology? An olive branch? An attempt to ease her guilt without actually admitting wrongdoing? I showed it to Michael without comment. He was quiet for a moment before speaking. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. I thought about all the things I could do. Return it with a note about not wanting her money. Accept it silently and let the question hang unanswered. Acknowledge it and open a door to potential reconciliation. Or simply let it be what it was, $200 toward Emma's medical care from someone who'd failed her spectacularly but might be starting to recognize that failure. "Keep it," I said finally. "For Emma. If Mom wants to help now in whatever small way she can manage, I'll take it. But it doesn't erase what she did. It doesn't mean everything's forgiven. It's just $200 in an account that needs tens of thousands. It's a start," Michael said. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just guilt money that lets her feel better without actually doing the hard work of accountability. Either way, it goes toward Emma's care, and that's what matters." The apartment was silent except for the faint sounds of Emma breathing in the next room, the gentle purr of Muffin on the armchair, the distant hum of traffic from the street below. We'd made it through. Not unscathed, not unchanged, but we'd survived. Emma was still fighting her cancer, still facing years of treatment and uncertainty. We were still facing mountains of medical debt even with the settlement and donations. My family was still fractured, probably irreparably. But we were here together in our home with resources to keep fighting. With proof that standing up to abuse was possible, even when it came from family. With the knowledge that sometimes the people who love you most are the strangers who show up when you need them, not the relatives who share your blood. I thought about where we'd been 3 months ago, when Emma was first diagnosed and the world had tilted sideways. I thought about the person I'd been then, naive enough to trust that family would protect us, that the money donated for Emma would be safe, that crisis would bring people together instead of exposing who they really were. That version of me felt impossibly distant now, like someone I'd been in another lifetime. The person I'd become was harder and clearer, and less willing to accept lies wrapped in the language of family loyalty. I didn't know if that was better or worse, just different. Changed by necessity, shaped by betrayal, strengthened by having to fight battles I should never have faced. Emma would wake up tomorrow in her own bed, and we'd navigate another day of medication schedules and temperature checks and careful monitoring. Brandon's next payment would come due next month, and we'd watch to ensure he followed through. The GoFundMe would continue accumulating donations from strangers who'd been moved by Emma's story. Dr. Park would adjust treatment protocols based on how Emma's body responded. Life would continue in its new configuration, forever divided into before Emma's diagnosis and after, before the betrayal and after. We couldn't go back to who we'd been. We could only move forward into whoever we were becoming. As I finally stood to go to bed, exhausted beyond measure, I paused in Emma's doorway. She was curled up with the stuffed elephant, her breathing steady and peaceful, her face relaxed in genuine sleep. The unicorn beanie had slipped off, revealing the nearly bald head underneath, but she looked beautiful anyway. She looked like someone worth fighting for, someone worth risking everything to protect. I'd burn down my family for this child, and I'd do it again without hesitation. That's what love meant, I'd learned. Not keeping the peace at any cost. Not protecting comfort and harmony, but standing up and fighting back when someone you love is threatened, even if the threat comes from inside your own family. Especially then. The weeks following Thanksgiving blurred together in a rhythm that became our new normal. Emma's treatment schedule dominated everything. Chemotherapy cycles that left her drained and nauseous for days, followed by brief windows of relative normalcy where she'd have enough energy to play with Muffin or work on puzzles at the kitchen table. We learned to celebrate the small victories that other families took for granted. A day without vomiting. An afternoon where she felt strong enough to walk around the block. A blood count high enough to avoid transfusion. These moments became our measuring sticks for progress, tiny increments of hope in an ocean of uncertainty. Brandon's second payment arrived on schedule in late December. Another $5,000 deposited into Emma's medical account without comment or communication. The money came through an automated bank transfer, sterile and impersonal, as if removing human interaction could somehow sanitize what it represented. Victoria Brennan confirmed receipt and noted it in her records, the legal machinery grinding forward with bureaucratic efficiency. 7 more payments remained on the schedule, stretching into summer, each one a reminder of what he'd done and what we'd had to fight to recover. The new GoFundMe continued to grow in ways that felt both miraculous and overwhelming. By Christmas, it had surpassed $80,000 from donations ranging from $5 to $5,000. People sent money with messages that made me cry in the hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m. An elderly woman on a fixed income sent $20 with a note explaining she'd lost her grandson to leukemia 40 years ago, and wished someone had been able to fight for him the way I'd fought for Emma. A group of firefighters from Michigan pooled together, $1,000 saying they'd seen the story shared on social media, and wanted to help one of their own, even though we had no connection to firefighting beyond Michael occasionally helping his uncle who'd been in the profession. The media attention gradually faded as new stories took over the news cycle, but the impact lingered in unexpected ways. I received messages from people across the country sharing their own experiences with family financial abuse during medical crises. A woman in Texas whose mother-in-law had stolen from her husband's cancer fund. A man in Florida whose brother had emptied their father's account while he was in hospice. The stories were heartbreaking in their similarity. A pattern of exploitation that happened in shadows because people were too ashamed or exhausted to fight back. Several people said that seeing Emma's story had given them courage to speak up about their own situations, to stop protecting family members who'd victimized them. My mother's $200 donation remained the only contact I'd had with her since Thanksgiving. She didn't call or text. She didn't attempt to see Emma. The silence was its own kind of statement, a choice she was making to prioritize her own comfort over a relationship with her dying granddaughter. Some days I felt angry about it, furious that she could be so stubborn and self-protective that she'd rather lose us than admit she'd been wrong. Other days I just felt sad, mourning the mother I'd thought I had, the grandmother Emma deserved, the family support we'd never actually possessed. Ashley reached out regularly, checking on Emma and offering what support she could from a distance. She'd apparently had a massive falling out with my mother after defending me at a family gathering, resulting in her own exclusion from the inner circle. "Welcome to the club," she'd texted Riley. "Turns out standing up for what's right makes you the bad guy in this family." We started having weekly phone calls, comparing notes on our childhoods, recognizing patterns we'd both been too close to see clearly before. The way my mother had always protected Brandon from consequences. The way disagreement was treated as betrayal. The way maintaining the facade of family harmony mattered more than actual relationships or truth. January brought a setback that sent us spiraling back into crisis mode. Emma developed pneumonia, her compromised immune system unable to fight off what would have been a minor illness for a healthy child. We spent 2 weeks back in the hospital, back in the familiar room that had become more home than our apartment, watching machines breathe for my daughter while antibiotics dripped into her port. The fear during those weeks was different than the initial diagnosis fear, sharper somehow because we'd already lost so much ground and couldn't afford to lose more. Michael took unpaid leave from work, something we couldn't afford but couldn't avoid. We needed to be together, both of us present for Emma in case the worst happened. She pulled through, her small body proving tougher than it looked, but the pneumonia pushed her treatment timeline back by 6 weeks. Dr. Park explained that they couldn't continue with chemotherapy until Emma's lungs fully recovered and her strength rebuilt. The delay was medically necessary, but terrifying from a cancer treatment perspective. Every week without chemo was a week the leukemia cells could potentially regroup and grow stronger. We'd gambled and won this time, but the stakes were getting higher with every complication. The hospital's social workers connected us with additional resources during that January admission. A charity that paid our rent for 2 months so Michael could take the unpaid leave. A meal delivery service specifically for families dealing with pediatric cancer. A support group for parents of children with leukemia where I met other mothers fighting similar battles. Women who understood the specific hell of watching your child suffer through treatment that was simultaneously saving and destroying them. These connections became lifelines, proof that community could be built even when family failed. February arrived with the kind of cold rain that made Seattle feel like the edge of the world. Emma was finally strong enough to resume treatment, though at a reduced intensity that would extend her overall protocol. We settled back into the exhausting routine of hospital stays and home recoveries, Michael back at work trying to make up for lost wages, me living between our apartment and the hospital depending on Emma's needs. The new GoFundMe money meant we could afford things that had seemed impossible before. A night nurse for the worst days when Emma needed round-the-clock monitoring. Organic foods that were easier on her damaged digestive system. Gas money to get to specialist appointments without choosing between transportation and groceries. Brandon's payments continued arriving on schedule through winter, each one reducing his remaining debt. He never reached out directly, never asked about Emma, never acknowledged her existence beyond the contractual obligation to repay what he'd stolen. The silence felt deliberate, a choice to treat the settlement as a business transaction rather than restitution to a niece he'd nearly killed through his greed. I wondered sometimes if he thought about her, if he felt guilt or shame, or if he'd managed to convince himself he'd been the victim in this situation. In March, something unexpected happened. Uncle Frank called me directly, his voice hesitant but determined. "I've been thinking about testifying," he said without preamble. "If you decide to pursue criminal charges against Brandon, I want to go on record about the pattern of behavior. About how your mother always protected him, how he's done things like this before and gotten away with it because family covered for him. I don't want to be part of that anymore. I don't want to be someone who stayed silent while a child suffered." The offer meant more than Frank probably realized. Having family corroboration, someone willing to speak truth even when it damaged family relationships, that carried weight both legally and personally. I told him I'd think about it, that Victoria Brennan and I were still deciding whether criminal charges made sense given that restitution was happening through the civil settlement. But knowing he was willing to stand up mattered. It meant I hadn't been crazy or vindictive for refusing to stay silent. It meant someone else in the family recognized that what had happened was wrong, unforgivably wrong, and deserved consequences. Emma turned 8 in April, a birthday I hadn't been certain she'd reach back in those dark early days of diagnosis. We threw a small party in the hospital playroom, just a few of her former classmates whose parents had stayed in touch and some of the nursing staff who'd become like family. Emma wore a princess dress over her port site bandages and a sparkly crown instead of her usual beanie. She managed 2 bites of birthday cake before nausea forced her to stop, but she was smiling in every photo, genuinely happy despite the clinical setting and medical reality that formed the backdrop of her celebration. The party was small and imperfect and nothing like the elaborate celebrations other 8-year-olds got. But it was hers and it was real and she was alive to experience it. That felt like victory enough. Michael and I stood together watching her open presents, our hands linked tight, both of us fighting tears that were equal parts joy and grief and exhausted relief. She'd made it another year. We'd survived another year. The future remained uncertain. Years of treatment still ahead. But we'd proven we could endure. We'd proven that love and stubbornness and refusing to accept injustice could create space for survival. By May, Brandon had made 6 of his 9 scheduled payments. $43,000 returned of the $73,000 stolen, with the final 3 payments due over summer. The money had been deployed exactly as promised, every dollar documented and tracked, paying for medications and specialist consultations, and the 1,000 small expenses that came with keeping a child alive through cancer treatment. The new GoFundMe had been used to cover what the settlement couldn't reach, the gap between what we had and what Emma needed, continuing to close through the generosity of strangers who'd taken our story into their hearts. I thought sometimes about the version of myself from a year ago, the woman who'd received that first devastating text message and felt her world collapse. She'd been so much more naive than I was now, still believing that family meant unconditional support, still trusting that people would do the right thing when a child's life hung in the balance. That version of me had died somewhere between the bank statements and the lawyer meetings and the decision to go public with our story. The person I'd become was harder and clearer, and less willing to accept comfortable lies, shaped by necessity into someone who could fight without apology when fighting was required. Emma's prognosis remained cautiously optimistic according to Dr. Park's latest assessment. The leukemia was responding to treatment, her cancer cells declining while healthy cells slowly rebuilt. She'd need at least another year of active chemotherapy followed by maintenance treatment extending into her early teens, but the trajectory was moving in the right direction. Survival wasn't guaranteed, it never was with pediatric cancer, but it was possible in ways it hadn't been when we'd started this journey. That possibility, fragile and hard one, was what we were fighting for. That was what made every difficult day, every public exposure, every burned family bridge worthwhile. The apartment felt different now than it had before Emma's diagnosis, marked by medical supplies and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from long-term crisis, but also by resilience we hadn't known we possessed. We'd learned we could survive betrayal from the people we'd trusted most. We'd learned that community could be built with strangers who showed up when family disappeared. We'd learned that fighting back against exploitation wasn't selfish or vindictive but necessary, the only way to protect what mattered most. These lessons had cost everything, but they'd also given us something invaluable: the certainty that we could face whatever came next, together, without needing permission or approval from people who'd proven they didn't deserve either. As spring gave way to early summer, Emma had a string of good days where her energy returned enough to play outside briefly, to laugh without it triggering nausea, to imagine a future beyond hospital rooms and treatment protocols. We took her to the park near our apartment, watched her carefully navigate the playground equipment with Michael hovering close enough to catch her if she fell. She looked so small still, her body recovering slowly from the damage treatment required, but she was alive and laughing and present. That was everything. That was worth every battle we'd fought and every relationship we'd lost, and every moment of exposure and vulnerability that going public had required. The final payment from Brandon was due in August, the last installment of debt repayment that would close this chapter financially if not emotionally. After that, we'd be free of the settlement's legal entanglement, though the scars from his theft would remain indefinitely. But we'd survive those scars too, I was learning. We'd survived everything else. We'd keep surviving whatever came next, one day at a time, one treatment at a time, one small victory at a time, until Emma was old enough to understand fully what had happened and why we'd fought the way we had. And when that day came, she'd know with certainty that her parents had chosen her over everything else, had burned down family structures to protect her, had refused to stay silent about abuse even when silence would have been easier. That knowledge would be our gift to her. Proof that love meant fighting without apology when someone you loved was threatened, no matter who the threat came from, or what it cost to stand against it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.